then you might say, yeah, technology means more impact. But if technology means solar panels instead of internal combustion or coal-fired power, if technology means a way of doing something that actually uses less natural resources or greater efficiency, you might think, well, wait a minute, the new technology actually means reduced impact. What if the whole, I mean, you've heard the figures, I'm sure. If we could get every single light bulb on the face of the earth to suddenly be one of these new technology compact fluorescents, we would use a whole lot less energy. Presumably that means technology can flip the other way around. Any other thoughts? Yeah. Okay, there's a sort of underlying implication here that population is just a sort of linear variable here. More incrementally, more people means more impact. But we've already seen that, in fact, that can be a very misleading way of thinking about impacts on things like biodiversity, right? It might actually be that the number of people is less important than the distribution of those people in units like households. Yeah. Okay. Affluence also looks like it's got a potentially rather slippery and potentially misleading role to play in this. I mean, there's a famous curve. What is it? It's the Laffer curve, right? I can't remember. The economists are always telling stories about some curve that first got written on a napkin at a restaurant, right? And one of them had to do with, how you plot environmental impact against wealth, against per capita income. And it goes, impact goes up steeply for a while, and then it flattens out, and then it goes back down. This is a conceptual kind of framework that reflects the fact that it's actually the wealthiest countries on earth that have the strictest environmental regulations, for example. That there's a notion that, in fact, at first, growing wealth means you go from a bike to a motorcycle to a car, or from a small shack to an enormous house. But that, in fact, at a certain point, your affluence actually tends to correlate with increasing environmental awareness, increasing environmental concern. You want the environment to be clean, and you can actually afford to demand it, to fight for, and get cleaner water, cleaner air. I mean, the United States, generally speaking, the environmental reforms of the late 60s and 70s, in terms of the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, all those things are seen as evidence that at a certain point, affluence actually creates the possibility of improved environmental conditions rather than degraded ones. So there again, exactly what sign these different component variables ought to have in this formula is entirely uncertain. So, other questions. What are the units that one would employ in making sense of this equation, right? I mean, it's easy to think of population as having a unit of numbers of people, right? Affluence you can think of as gross domestic product or maybe GDP per capita. Those units are pretty clear. But what are the units of technology and what are the units of impact? It's not at all clear what they should be. And to that extent, it's not clear how you would operationalize this formula even in a single case, right? Does P equal I divided by A times T? Right? Part of the beauty of equations is supposed to be that you can manipulate them like this. That's what math is so great at, right? But the idea that you could calculate population by taking impact and dividing it by affluence times technology is plainly ludicrous, right? That's absurd. And it points up the absurdity of thinking that this equation is, this is an equation that is like so widespread. It's like thrown around like if you don't think in terms of IPAT, you're like completely missing the boat. And my feeling is if you think in terms of IPAT and nothing else, you're not thinking. Sorry. So you need to account for the productivity and the resilience of the environment in question. That's another thing. It's like, to even think about impacts, you have to think about impacts relative to something. And that relative to is going to have multiple dimensions. One of them, at least, is going to be productivity, right? You can, the same impact will have the same gross sort of extraction of something will have a very different impact depending on whether you're extracting it from a highly productive system or not highly productive system. And you have to think about what's the capacity for the system to recover from the kind of impact that you're imposing. All of these things just introduce more problems. Anyway, I'll shut up now. Trends. According to the assessment, the consumption of ecosystem services is slowly being decoupled from economic growth. This is a very interesting claim. The evidence for it is presented in the form of graphs, figures such as these. So gross national product percentage of gross national product in agriculture, forestry, and fisheries for 6 different countries, UK, US, Germany, China, Russia, Japan, period 1820 to 1992. Then gross percentage, GNP and percentage in mining, manufacturing, construction, utilities, and the service industries. And what you see is the apparent dwindling of agriculture, forestry, and fisheries in these economies over time. They become less and less important as percentage of GNP. You see a kind of slower rise and then decline, at least in some of these countries, in mining, manufacturing, construction, and utilities. Rapid increase in China from 1950 to the present. Less, also an increase in Japan and Russia, but a decline in the countries of the US and Europe. And then this astronomical increase in services. What does that tell you? Does this tell us that economic activity is slowly being decoupled from ecosystem services? Well, China, in the early part of this, probably would have been characterized as a developing country. I mean, this is widely, it's well established that services become a more significant part of economic activity as economies develop, as they become more affluent. And it is widely, bandied about that a service economy is not about natural resources, right? It's about the production of services, not goods. It's certainly not about the production of corn and wheat or timber. Those are things that happen, it's not about producing cars and factories and that kind of thing. And therefore, there's this notion that it is decoupled from ecosystem services. And in one sense, I suppose that's true. You don't need pollination and photosynthesis to produce a consulting report on the future of the insurance industry. Or do you? I mean, in a sense, you do somewhere, but it's not directly part of that activity. What are the problems with this? Yeah. Okay. An economy dominated by services is not necessarily one that uses less energy, for example. In fact, it tends to use vastly more energy. It's also true that just because the percentage of the economy devoted to agriculture has plummeted doesn't mean that the overall amount of agriculture has diminished, right? The agricultural productivity of the world's farms has actually increased dramatically, even if it's become a smaller part of the overall economy as industry and then services have developed. So I'd say it's sort of an illusion to think that somehow ecosystem services are no longer relevant as you become a so-called service economy. They are perhaps more attenuated or indirectly linked, but the actual consumption of resources does not slow down as you become a service-oriented economy. Trends. Dry lands are particularly vulnerable. This is kind of interesting. population growth is most rapid in dryland systems, even though dryland systems tend to be less productive than wetter systems, wetter biomes, in terms of biological productivity, right? So net primary production is lowest, or almost lowest, it's even lower in polar, but is nonetheless, those are areas seeing enormous, the most rapid population increase. The relationship with gross domestic product is also very skewed. I'm interested in this because I care about arid and semi-arid grasslands, for example. The rate of loss of grasslands is extremely high, and that's true at a global scale. Other trends. Global trade magnifies the effect of governance, regulations, and management practices on ecosystems and their services, enhancing good practices, but worsening the damage caused by poor practices. So trade has got a sort of magnifying effect on these activities. Any idea why that would be? I mean, that seems like a very strange relationship they're trying to describe, almost contradictory. Any thoughts? No? Yeah.
Poor practices are cheaper.
Okay, frequently poor practices are cheaper. It may cost less to get the equipment together to do them, or it may be that you can do it more quickly, right? And you can think about this in terms of, is it quicker to clear cut a forest or to selectively log a forest? Is it cheaper to dredge up the entire bottom of the ocean with an enormous machine and pull out the fish you want and then throw everything else away? Or to use a much more careful technique that only pulls out what you want in the first place and leaves everything there? Yes?
Trade increases specialization, so some countries who are specializing in car manufacturing will intensify that, so therefore learning certain practices maybe less time for less.
Okay, that's another good point. Trade tends to increase the overall sort of division of labor spatially in the world, right? You get, with more trade, you get people in different places specializing more and more in whatever it is they can do within the international division of labor. And they, the greater access they have to world markets and the more they can, what that means is that somebody who's got a much cheaper way to do something is going to have an advantage the more trade there is, right? And that could mean negative practices with high impacts but low costs that are magnified because trade increases demand for the output. It also can, however, mean that if you establish strict benchmarks on, regulatory benchmarks on what's permitted, trade can have the kind of enforcement effect, right? Like if the U.S. or the European Union says we're not going to buy tuna caught in ways that might endanger dolphins, and other countries in the world are killing dolphins in the process of capturing tuna, there's no legal authority to tell them to stop. But if they're dependent on trade and those become the regulatory hurdles they have to clear, then perhaps they change their practices, right? So that's how this can have the kind of contradictory or apparently contradictory effect. Urban demographic and economic growth has been increasing pressures on ecosystems globally, but affluent rural and suburban living often places even more pressure on ecosystems. So the trend towards urbanization globally, yes, there are obvious ways in which urban areas have very concentrated ecological impacts. On the other hand, you can't let rural areas or affluent areas off the hook because, in fact, as we've seen again with the issue of suburbanization and household size, they can have very pronounced impacts in and of themselves. Okay, where are we going with this? Spatial and temporal scales of ecosystem processes. I might just ask you to read this on your own from the lecture slides. The point of this being to compare the scale, the temporal and spatial scale of different processes. And so at the top we have processes having to do with ecosystem structure and species composition. In here we have climate change related processes. So this is the release and mixing of CO2. This is how long it takes for a CO2 pulse to dissipate to 50% of its original magnitude. And this is how long it takes the sea level change to adjust, to reach equilibrium as global temperatures rise. And it's the disparity in the temporal and spatial scales of these processes that creates such enormous problems and difficulties for us, right? So in a very short period of time, we can increase the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere quite significantly. And yet it might be 100 years or 10,000 years before the full implications of that act play themselves out in terms of actual ecosystem processes, which means we don't respond to the threat of sea level rise because it takes so bloody long to actually happen, right? We don't think of it as an urgent problem, even though we're committing ourselves to it on temporal scales that are completely within our control. Okay, I don't have time to go. Let's look at this question of markets. This is, I think, we got 7 minutes. As you read this, perhaps you noticed, perhaps you didn't, that the question of markets, well, they talk a lot about certain kinds of markets. And the question of the market and the role of the market crops up over and over and over again, right? So it says most resource management decisions are most strongly influenced by ecosystem services entering markets. As a result, the non-marketed benefits are often lost or degraded. These non-marketed benefits are often high and sometimes more valuable than the marketed ones. So in any given ecosystem, we can see a variety of processes, functions, outputs, different ecosystem services that are being produced, say, in that system. Some of them take on monetary value in markets, and others do not. The corn that you harvest from a farm field takes on a market value. The pollination value that might have been there had you left it in native prairie, no one knows. It doesn't have a price, right? And they're fond of these types of graphs in which they try to demonstrate that the non-marketed goods or services, the non-marketed values, such as carbon sequestration, watershed protection, non-timber forest products, and recreation and hunting, the right-hand column in each of these, for each of these countries, exceeds the marketed value. Now, of course, this is if you somehow come up with a way of assigning a value to things that don't have prices, right? You assign some kind of value to carbon sequestration. Well, if there's a price for carbon, that's not so hard. But if there's not, you have to sort of come up with one, right? And this, the annual flow of benefits from forests is what this is. In selected countries, they're fond of suggesting that you actually lose value when you decide to cut the trees down and sell the timber, because the other things that aren't marketed are actually more valuable. Now, again, that assumes something, right? It assumes that you can find some kind of common framework. Degradation of ecosystem services represents a loss of a capital asset. Yet traditional national accounts do not include measures of resource depletion or of the degradation of these resources. When an action results in the degradation of a service that harms other individuals, no market mechanism exists, nor in many cases could it exist, to ensure that the individuals harmed are compensated for the damages they suffer. So somebody cuts down a forest, those trees go to market, they sell them, they make a bunch of money. Okay, but what about the impacts to the people living downstream when the forest is no longer there and it floods? And it floods their farm fields and they lose their houses and they can't grow any food anymore. I mean, whose account, how do we balance these things, right? Frequently, the impacts downstream not only don't have a price, but nobody even bothers to figure out the connections or hold the people who got the forest down accountable, right? Similarly, for GNP or GDP measurements as a whole, a lot of these non-marketed services are simply not accounted for. So, Many changes in ecosystem management have involved the privatization of what were formerly common pool resources. This is a note statement from the summary, right? The translation seems to me to be when something gets privatized and turned into a marketed good, it frequently or maybe even routinely results in degradation. Commodification leads to degradation. And yet, the recommendation of the assessment as a whole is in fact to commodify more and more and more ecosystem services. Greater use of economic instruments and market-based approaches in the management of ecosystem services is what they recommend. In other words, if you had to put a price, if you could find a price to put on the flood control services of that forest, then the people who own that forest would have reason to not cut it down. Right? If you could develop a market for the carbon that's sequestered and the wildlife that finds habitat and the water quality and quantity that's improved and all of these other things, the flood control services, if all of those things could be priced, then the forest wouldn't get cut down and our problem would be at least mitigated or ameliorated, right? If not solved altogether. Now, this is something we're going to have to think about a lot the rest of the semester, is this: what happens when markets intervene between the point at which some natural resource is produced and the point at which it's consumed? And what's different about a market-mediated relationship from other kinds of ways that people might relate to a natural resource or an ecosystem? This framework of ecosystem services is very much sort of trendy right now. It's very much the way the world's policymakers are attempting to grapple with these problems. And you'll see it in climate change. You see it in a whole range of regulatory and environmental governance issues. But it all hinges very much on this particular valuation, this notion that markets can be the solution, even though they are also, pretty much in everyone's opinion, the problem. Okay? We'll see you on Thursday.